Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.
Romania? Absolutely fantastic. The only other thing to note is that if teams could please indicate what their preference is for receiving POIs at the start of your speech, or your first speaker can indicate what all of your preferences at the start of their speech, and if the other team can take note of that and hopefully observe it. Obviously, if there's any tech issues, we will follow all of the tech rules, so don't worry. I hope you all have a fantastic debate. Really good luck and really well done for how you've done so far. I'm very pleased to welcome the first speaker from the proposition. Here.
Sorry, our Wi-Fi connection is quite unstable. Is it okay that people who don't speak turn off their cameras? Because maybe that might help.
Do you want us to turn our cameras off as well?
No, that's okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Whenever you're ready, Netherlands, go ahead.
And we would like POIs, just hands up.
Hands up, that's fine. I assume everybody's able to hear me. For years, academic research papers have been used by corporate industries to push forward their own agenda, misleading consumers and outcrowding research that is actually needed in society. I'm going to bring you a 2-point case. First, how corporate funding leads to harmful conclusions, and secondly, why corporate funding crowds out research that helps society. But before I do that, let me set up the debate for you. Firstly, what do we propose? We would ban corporate sponsorship as a whole for all kinds of academic papers. So you would not be allowed to fund any academic papers that might be published. To illustrate this, Apple is able to make their own technology, but it can't fund research on the effect of iPhones that might be published in any kind of scientific paper. Secondly, scientists are not allowed to work at a company and a university at the same time. What do we then think? The alternative is on our side of the house. We think governments, alumni, and non-profit organizations and celebrity funds already fund a lot of universities and research centers in the status quo. However, because in the status quo, these centers have corporate sponsorship as well, they often use these donations for things that don't necessarily need money, such as new parks or new winds, in a second. We think the problem in today's society is not the lack of funds, but the distribution of funds into research. Before I move on, go.
So just to clarify, Jeff Bezos as an individual, is he allowed to fund research?
He is not allowed to fund research that might affect on anything that his company does. Because what kind of research is actually funded by corporations? We think they only fund research that benefits their own brand, because that's the only reason they want to spend that amount of money. We think they need to do so because they needed to convince their consumers that their product is actually nice, which is why the only companies that actually do this are the ones with very harmful products. For example, Coca-Cola investing money to prove that obese is not caused by an overload of sugar, but just a lack of movement. What does this funding then look like? We think the resources and equipment often come from universities or research centers. However, corporate industries compensate for the time and energy scholars put into that research. This means corporate sponsorship directly takes away resources and equipment from other studies. Let's move on to my first speech substantive, how corporate funding leads to harmful conclusions. Why does corporate sponsorship lead to wrong outcomes? 3 reasons. Firstly, I think they often have already an hypothesis, e.g. cola saying obesity doesn't come from sugar, and therefore scientists only get money if they prove that hypothesis is right. Therefore, they have a direct incentive to skew with the outcome in order for them to make money. Secondly, because these corporate institutions create a culture that never allows for critical research. The reason for that is because researchers themselves know that at the moment they're critical, they can never get funding from that corporation again. This means they themselves don't get funding, but it also means they're unlikely to be hired by universities or other research institutions because they want funding from these corporations as well. That means that you're never allowed to have critical thinking onside these things corporate industries fund as well. Thirdly, we think corporate industry want to make money as fast as possible, therefore have the outcomes of the research as fast as possible. Therefore, they push for research to go extremely fast. This means the likelihood for scientists to make fault is way bigger because they're not allowed to take the time they need to properly do the research, but they need to do it in a certain time span. Why do we think that bad research is so extremely harmful? Firstly, we think the media picks up on these bad research because the consumers often understand this topic. Therefore, if it's funded and it has a bad conclusion, this topic often comes in the news. Therefore, the consumers themselves think it is the truth. But secondly, because they don't allow critics, and therefore this is the only outcome that is actually published to society. What is the impact of this? We see 2 distinct groups. Firstly, on fields with there are conflicting studies, such as often is happening in the food industry, because it's very unclear what the impact is because there are so many variables. We think biased research harmed consumers for years. We think it's therefore, for example, Hershey trying to disprove that sugar addiction isn't real is something that can cause consumers to think chocolate is a fine thing to eat for years to come. But secondly, we think the really harmful industries are their funding research is the reason the truth about cigarettes, fossil fuels, and all other kinds of directly harm society has been delayed for years. Because they fund so much research, doctors advised children to smoke in the past century. Because they funded research that goes against their good research. For example, the tobacco industry funding research to disprove the Scandinavian model of testing cigarettes works because they don't want research that proves that their own industry is faulty. We think in those industries, in a couple of decades, the truth might come out. But in the time before that, the harmful consequences of their actions stay. Second argument, by corporate funding crowds out research that helps society. There are 4 independent layers in this argument. All 4 of them needs to be proven separately. Firstly, on innovators. We think the problem in academic research is a lack of creative minds. We think often scholars are smart themselves, but they are not good at finding new ideas. However, at the moment you are good, you're likely to be poached up by corporate institutions because they have more money to give you. On our side, they would go to universities or independent research centers because they do not have the alternative to go to research funded by corporation. What's the impact of this? We think the minds that could have actually made a difference never go to the fields where they're most needed because corporate checks lures them away. Second layer, unlimited resources. We think universities and research centers have research that is needed for this research, such as equipment, for example, MRIs, but also simply test groups, where if you want to test what the effect is on a large amount of people, you often go to these centers where they have that. But thirdly, simply having laboratories is something that only happens inside these universities or institutions. We think corporations give money to use these kind of things. However, it's not enough for these institutions to buy new ones. Because if it was enough, the corporation would have bought them for themselves. However, when centers are allowing corporate research to use their resources, other research can't access them because the labs and equipment are needed for the bad research funded by the corporation, because the test groups are exhausted because they can't do multiple tests as well. This means that even if a researcher has a good idea and actually wants to invest in it, they don't have the opportunity to test it because all the resources are exhausted. Thirdly, we simply think that even if you don't believe all the things I just taught you, the good scientific papers aren't published in the first place. We think there are limited spots for scientific papers, and now scientific papers need to compete with corporate papers. We think corporate papers are always more likely to be published. Firstly, because they're often about very flashy topics. For example, in the milk industry, where they funded research that said that alternative milk sources, such as soy milk, cause breast cancer. Therefore, they're more likely to be published because they are very flashy topics. Secondly, they're often extremely big projects. For example, an extremely large project that wanted to prove how excessive use of antibiotics is actually a very good thing. I think because they're so big, they're more likely to be published because they have more attention. Thirdly, because they are often things readers like. For example, saying smoking isn't bad because that directly helps themselves. We think therefore scientific papers always have an incentive to publish corporate papers before they do the right one. That means that even if you have a good scientific study, you're never going to be published in the first place. Lastly, on peer reviews. We think all research needs to be redone. However, at the moment these toxic and bad studies are redone, they fall into the same toxic culture. Therefore, useless projects need to be redone time and time again, meaning they suck up more and more research every time a peer review happens. In the best case scenario for site opposition, this research isn't skewed at all. However, at the moment, it's still not useful for society, but it crowd out the research that we actually need. For all these reasons, I beg you to propose.
I thank that speaker very much, and I welcome the first speaker from the opposition.
Can you hear me if I speak like this? Is it fine? Judges?
Yeah, it's good for me.
Okay. One sec. In a world where government leaders like Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro are decidedly anti-science and decidedly want to systematically cut funding from the most important research areas, we think that we have no choice but to lend ourselves to funds that come from corporate boards headed by the likes of Elon Musk and Bill Gates. Sure, they may never be perfect, but they still fill up a void of resources that currently exists in academia. In my speech, I'm going to have two main parts. One, challenging a bit what team proposition has brought to us so far. Secondly, one big argument about how you get less research and less research that is qualitative on proposition. Okay, let's talk a bit about what proposition brought to us so far. And first, let's have a clarification. Currently, in our world, there are many mechanisms that are used in order to regulate what sort of scientific content gets published. Things that they also mentioned, like peer review, like transparency of funding for research and academic institutes. These things already exist, and there is a trend towards regulating these sorts of aspects more. Team proposition uniquely has to tell us why this mechanism of corporate funding is so vitiated that it just has to disappear completely. There's absolutely no way to regulated. Okay, one point about their model. They tell us that scientists cannot simultaneously work in corporations and in academic institutions on their side of the house. Okay, if corporations are so fixated on getting these like skewed studies that you talk about, and if they are willing to put so much money in it, we think that on your side of the house, it's likely that you will see a lot of scientists, a lot of researchers migrate to the public sector, work directly as employed by corporations, since they're willing to pay much more, and where they will have less restraints and less regulations actually placed on the content that they research. Secondly, they tell us that scientists get paid in accordance with the results. So you need to have a predetermined result for you to get paid. Sure, in some very small instances, this may happen, but this isn't the way in which the vast majority of research activity works. We think that many scientists are not so corrupt, no thank you, so irreparably corrupt that they're just willing to sell off themselves. Many of them have jobs and reputations that they have to defend. This is not a very likely scenario. Then they talk to us about how all resources in research labs are exhausted. But then if the studies are so superficial and so like rushed as you claim them to be, we don't really see why all of the resources in universities and in research institutes are depleted. We think that the reality is that there's still quite a lot of room in most universities for a lot of researchers to conduct their activity at the same time. And one last point, they talk to us about how scientific papers get filled up with these corporate studies. Guys, for a study to be published in a scientific paper, there is massive peer review, massive scrutiny from entire networks of scientists who are willing to peer review it. We don't think that this is really happening. And if it's happening, then the corporate studies are very easily weeded out through these mechanisms. So before anything else, and before I go into my own substance about how you get less research that is qualitative, if there's any POI. Okay, so why you get less research that is qualitative? First point here, research is incredibly expensive, right? You first need to pay for staff, which means top-notch experts that spend their time and their energy into working for one project for like a lot of time. This means that you need good money for it to be worth it for them. Secondly, you need to pay for facilities, for things like lab maintenance and transportation of researchers to research sites. We think that, for example, for a genome mapping lab to be built, it requires $1 million just for it to be built. Then you have to do the maintenance, a lot of money. 3, we think that it's very time consuming. Most studies and real studies take up months and months and sometimes years. So it means lots and lots of money that have to be invested continuously. 2, how are corporations currently sponsoring their research? But before that, sure.
So why do companies have an interest in sponsoring research which is actually beneficial to like society rather than their bottom line? Okay,
great. This is what I was about to explain. So in reality, there are 2 ways in which corporations are currently sponsoring their research. One way that they totally miss on their side of the house is that many institutions are currently in need of money for research projects, so they issue calls for sponsorship to the private sector who is willing to give them up. Many companies, as part of their PR and CSR strategy, want to offer money to causes that seem very socially significant, like research projects on breast cancer or on stem cell research. This is currently happening with a lot of corporations because it's a very good PR move for them. So a lot of corporate sponsorship works in this way. And indeed, some corporate sponsorship also works in a way in which companies are looking to gather expert insight into specific fields, so they commission studies. But note that in many instances, companies have an intrinsic incentive to genuinely understand that field. For example, when they commission a study into consumer purchasing habits and choices, they want that study to be accurate in order for them to be able to adapt it to the reality of their own marketing practices. So a lot of studies are actually have an intrinsic no thank you incentive to be quite well done. 3, why is this research generally reliable and qualitative? 1, we've already explained to you that there's an intrinsic motivation for many of these corporations to understand the things that they're commissioning research for. But 2, the research community is increasingly well connected. Peer review can now happen through internet networks that span the entire globe. It's much easier to do than it used to be in the past. And precisely because there have been some scandals, as Team Proposition mentions, there's a lot of pressure now in the scientific community to make sure that fewer and fewer corporate studies that are skewed actually get on the market. So we think that these mechanisms are continually improving. What does this mean? One, that research institutes themselves want to preserve their academic integrity. If you actually get caught that you published a study that was skewed, that had no proper academic rigor in its research methods, because you were paid by a corporation, your reputation as an academic institution is done. We think that many of these institutions, however corrupt they may be, still want to maintain a good reputation amongst the academic community for more research to researchers to come to them, for the state to be willing to collaborate with them. So we think that that's one incentive. Two, researchers themselves don't want to destroy their own careers by being attached for the rest of their lives to the name of this one study that was so skewed and paid off by corporations. So we think that there are intrinsic incentives that they never interact with for academic rigor to be kept. What happens on proposition? An important stream of revenue for research, no thank you, research funding disappears. Who's left to fund that? The government. Why is it unlikely that it will properly compensate for this funding gap? One, governments have short-term populist incentives, meaning that they want to spend money on the things that give them the immediate political benefits that they require. So that's very unlikely that they're gonna just massively increase research funding. But two, many populist leaders have active incentives not, like the Donald Trump administration not wanting to invest in green energy research, although it's incredibly important. What is the impact? We get less funding for real research on proposition side of the house. Studies take longer before they yield any results. Fewer studies are commissioned in the first place. Lower pay for researchers, so fewer researchers are incentivized to become researchers in these academic institutes. This is so bad because underinvestment in pandemic prevention research, for example, is what got us into this current situation. Now, climate change research is so important, but you don't get the proper money for it to be carried out. You need every single penny that you can get in order to yield proper results on research. For all these reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker very much, and I welcome the second speaker for the proposition.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? I'm just gonna have a little bit to drink first. Panel, don't be fooled by team opposition. They tell you that corporate sponsorship leads to lots of amazing research. But what is the only example that they can point to? Efficient marketing. Look, clearly, companies don't only sponsor absolutely destructive studies, while they clearly do that in a lot of cases. But even in the best case scenario for team opposition, where it's marginally beneficial for society, that margin is very tight, because clearly the only thing these companies really care about is making more money, not making sure that people have better lives, like the alternative sources of funding that we support on side proposition. In my speech, I'm largely going to be doing two things in this debate. Firstly, talking about the amount of useful research. And I'm going to be taking team opposition at their best. And then I'm going to be talking about a distinct impact that we talk about, namely the harmful narratives that we get out of this corporate research. I'm going to be responding to some of the rebuttal we get from op. And lastly, I'm going to be weighing those two things off. So let's start off with the amount of useful research, things we hear from team opposition. I'm going to largely respond to two lines they give you. Firstly, they tell you that lots of donations come for universities for non-profit incentive reasons, things like corporate social responsibility. I have three responses. Firstly, we tell you that often this type of funding is largely covered by things like the NGOs. When opposition has Bill Gates as one of their most important examples, I think this mechanism largely falls away because clearly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is an NGO and not a for-profit corporation. Secondly, a lot of this funding has to go towards large, flashy PR things like building a library with the Pfizer name on it, which means that a lot of the money they do receive for the best intentions doesn't actually go to good research. But thirdly, we tell you that even if there isn't a specific project tied to this type of research, it still breeds an incentive within universities not to be critical of companies, because they know that if you publish that paper that shows that smoking does lead to lung cancer, Philip Morris is highly unlikely to donate $1 billion at the end of the year. That means that there's still massive harmful incentives, even in their best case scenario. But then let's talk about the second line they give you, namely that governments are unwilling to fund this type of research. I have two responses. Firstly, a lot of the things that they mention about governments are true for companies and way more so. Companies have a much shorter incentive than governments to publish research, namely because they probably have a CEO that's only there for 5 years and he only really cares what happens as long as he's sitting at the top office, and he doesn't care what research gets produced 20 years down the line. I think this is probably more short-termistic than governments, because often there is at least some gain to be had if you can tell your people, look, we don't have a cancer cure today, but because of the money I'm investing into it, we're going to have a cancer cure tomorrow. But secondly, I think that governments have a massive incentive to invest in the public good. Even their worst case example, namely Donald Trump, spends billions of dollars every year in scientific research. Look at the amount of money that went into a corona vaccine, or the continual war on cancer started by Nixon, where hundreds of billions of dollars goes into helpful medical research every year. Clearly, if you can tell your voters, yes, this money is going towards science, but this money is also going towards research, which will make sure that your grandmother doesn't die, governments have an incentive to do that. I don't believe anything coming out of team opposition on this point. But okay. I have a more broad question within this clash on useful research, which is to say, opposition has to prove two large things. Firstly, that companies are likely to invest in useful research. Why is this untrue? 3 reasons. Firstly, I've already told you often good research takes a very long time, and companies have short-run invest incentives because of short-term leadership. Secondly, I tell you that a lot of the research that we actually research that comes out of companies that is useful towards society, things like inventing new products, has to happen in-house and doesn't happen at educational institutions simply because they have to keep it top secret. And the second that they do that research at a public institution, it becomes public knowledge. But thirdly, I simply think that often corporations only really do research at good institutions because they want the title of that institution. Therefore, if they are actually doing something which will directly help humanity, they don't need that title and they're more likely to do it in-house. But when they need some type of authority, that is when they look towards research institutions, and that is often also when it's the more harmful things that they want to publish. Because if Philip Morris says cigarettes aren't bad, no one believes them. But if MIT says it, people are far more likely to listen. The second thing opposition had to prove was that the type of research that these corporations actually sponsor is useful, even if it isn't that harmful. I have 3 reasons why this is unlikely to be the case. The first is companies have a for-profit incentive, not an incentive to help their consumers best. This looks like putting lots of research into marketing strategies to convince people to buy the latest iPhone, but not actually making an iPhone, which leads to making sure people in Africa have access to bank accounts. Secondly, I think it also leads to things like cutting costs, inventing a new battery, which is more likely to explode simply because it costs less money. Secondly, I think that often the type of research these people do is distinctly beneficial to wealthy consumers, because there's a lot more money to be made for companies selling to people who have money, and also often the most new things are only sold to rich customers. It often just leads to research only helping the wealthiest 10% of society, but very little research going to the things that can help the bottom 50%, because they're unlikely to be able to pay enough money for companies to really be interested. Thirdly, I simply tell you that consumers don't always necessarily do what's best for society. That is to say, lots of consumers want a new iPhone more than they want new groundbreaking agricultural techniques to make sure that people in the Sahel can farm without needing as much water. That means that even if opposition proves that companies don't want to misdirect consumers and they're purely listening to consumer incentives, those consumer incentives are not aligned with what's actually best for society, but rather making sure that they have the new flashy products, something that I don't necessarily want to support in this debate. that means that there's likely a large harm coming out of team opposition, which is to say a lot of the research they support isn't really beneficial to society. But the distinct harm that we tell you is that even if you get more money from corporations, there is still a direct opportunity cost, because the amount of researchers that are highly specialized in one specific field for one application isn't thousands, it's closer to 10 people. At the moment where corporations then force 5 of those people to work on their little hobby project, which doesn't help society, we have a lot less of the brightest minds of our society working on research that is actually useful towards the common good rather than companies' bottom line. But the second clash in this debate is about harmful conclusions. And we get a lot of reactions from team opposition about why this is unlikely to be the case. But the main response that we get is essentially peer review exists. Why is this highly unlikely to be sufficient? I give you 2 large reasons. Firstly, a lot of peer review is really dodgy. You can get published into a scientific journal by simply paying $1,000, and then that scientific research will peer review, but they're really just going to okay whatever you do. But secondly, a lot of peer review it's done by the academics in that field. But those academics, they don't want to contradict the companies either, because they know that then they will never get the sponsorship that they need to make sure that their projects get published in the future. That means that peer review doesn't really work. And we have the massively harmful conclusions that come out of team opposition. And I think if you want to make sure that people know smoking causes cancer, you vote team proposition.
I thank that speaker very much and welcome the second speaker for the opposition.
Am I audible? Actually,
you are.
Oh. Could I quickly go to the bathroom, please?
Oh. Sorry, who asked that? Hi, was it Team Romania?
Yeah.
Run.
Thank you. Okay, sorry.
That's okay. I welcome the second speaker for the opposition. Here.
All right. Let me speak about team proposition's main example, which is people find out that smoking causes cancer. I think that was quite obvious, like up until it was already obvious since like the 90s. We think that generally, for instance, the truth is that currently a lot of tobacco companies do a lot of corporate sponsorship towards things like studying and researching cancer cures, or at least researching ways of quitting smoking, because they have acknowledged their social responsibility, and everyone already knows that smoking causes cancer. For instance, Philip Morris invested a lot of corporate sponsorship into finding alternatives for smoking, and IQOS was created. We think that generally, team proposition has a huge tendency to speak about research only in the thesis of studies. We think that there are plenty of ways in which research is manifested, not only studies. And by the way, if their only thing is studies, and their main point is that, well, experts are taking too much time with very useless stuff. Well, let me explain the fact that, don't worry, team proposition, the people that have a master's degree in research don't spend their time with doing stupid studies, right? So we think that generally we have to understand that they're also banning, for instance, car companies that generally want to invest and sponsor research facilities which look into more efficient electric engines or like pieces of the engine. We think that generally they're also banning that. And they've said in their setup that look will allow Apple to have their own like investment in tech. But we think that that's dependent on a company having their own researching team and having the best people. We see that it's simply just way more efficient for companies to be able to sponsor the research facilities that are very good at what they're doing and that have a common interest. So if you're interested in replacing fossil fuels and you have an academic research unit in your country which researches that, it just makes sense for you to sponsor that, and we don't see why they would have an interest into actually having a malicious intent. So if we are only speaking about research towards technology, there's literally nothing that could be harmful as a result of that. No, thank you. Right. A huge point that team proposition doesn't interact with is the fact that they're, first of all, overburdening themselves when they say that we won't allow researchers to like work both for the company and both for the academic institution. A, we don't see how they have the power to do that. They never explained that would be why that would be likely to happen. But B, the problem with that is that hence, they themselves characterize researchers and scientists as being so money hungry that they give up all their prestige, all their personal interests just for the money of the corporation. Then we don't see, no thank you, why they wouldn't on their side of the house, on the comparative, just quit the academic institution and just go for the corporation's money. At the moment, corporations would be very happy to have researchers just be hired by them. The difference is that those scientists want to keep the prestige of the institution in which you're in, because you are way better for yourself if you're a researcher at the Oxford Research Institution rather than a researcher at Coca-Cola. Our proposition is just simply giving the corporations the capability to get and hire a lot of researchers that on their side of the house are left without funds. And the comparative is that generally, even if they don't get the same people, the simple fact that they will be doing the same researches, the same studies, no thank you, just it won't be done for an academic institution, doesn't really change much, because we think that generally consumers that are looking at studies do not care whether or not, and do not even search whether or not Coca-Cola, when they said that sugar doesn't cause obesity, they do not look at whether or not it was a prestigious academic research facility which did the search, or it was Coca-Cola themselves. They generally just look at it and are like, cool, I'll just drink Coca-Cola. So we don't see what their comparative actually is when it comes to like these very malicious studies that are actually happening. But if we look, and before I move on, yeah.
Do you not think that malicious conclusions often lead to way worse outcomes when they are done by Oxford, MIT, or Harvard rather than the company that is incentivized to do so?
Okay, so first of all, when Oxford has the prestige of, so if their point is these researchers are results are way harmful because they are approved by the prestige of the institution, that means that the prestige exists. And the prestige cannot at the same time exist when they are publishing false studies, when they are publishing harmful results, when they're being bought off by companies. They cannot both have the prestige and also be these corrupt facilities that don't have any independence and that don't care about the general public good. The comparative is that if these research facilities want to keep their prestige, then they'll probably keep transactions as clean as possible and just accept sponsorships and continue to do their work. We have explained on our first speech that we have a lot of instances in which the research facility just asks for the funding from the corporation. So For them, they cannot be both corrupt and bad facilities and also offer this like big idea of improvement by just having their signing on the paper. On the comparative, that would just simply happen on their side of the house when they're just hired by the actual company. But also, we think that they have a huge issue with their lack of explanation on where this replacement of funding will actually be coming from, because most of the research facilities are sponsored by corporations, right? We think that Trump just cut off research both to the World Health Organization, both to the green research facilities in the US. Most states generally do not have a huge incentive to invest in the long-term research facilities. They're saying that corporations have short-term incentives. Well, if corporations are the agents in our society that have short-term incentives, which are probably in the institutions that have the biggest incentive to invest for the long term, then politicians that are just changing every 4 years and that have the power to shape the budget and that will be the main source of funding on their side of the house for these research facilities are also extremely short-term incentives, and we think that they don't have even the market information to be able to make those decisions. They said that, well, it leads to unnecessary research. But who says that? What's unnecessary research? They're saying as if companies don't simply have the autonomy of investing in whatever research they want, and the research facilities have the autonomy to choose what research they want to do. They choose whether or not it's relevant, whether or not it is relevant. We think that still exists. We don't think they have the comparative advantage. We do it better on our side.
I thank that speaker very much and welcome the third speaker from the proposition team.
Can everyone hear me if I speak like this?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Panel, aside from the fact that DLO still hasn't given us a good example of what good research from a company looks like, aside from good marketing, I'll take them at their best. Because in their best case scenario, this debate only takes place in America, where Trump doesn't donate to climate change research, and there's one good company, unclear why, that suddenly funds billions into that field. But hold on, the USA is the perfect example of our side of the house, where there's a huge lobby of oil companies that fund billions and billions of dollars into research that disproves the existence of climate change in the first place. Trump is only in power for 8 years. That's not the core of the problem. The core of the problem are billion-dollar industries that have corrupted science for decades now, that have made us believe that smoking isn't that bad, that you can't get addicted to morphine, whilst there are millions of victims in the USA alone that have been victimized by this industry. I'm incredibly proud to propose. In my speech, I'll first clarify some mistakes that the DLO made, then talk about the incentives of government versus companies and why there's an opportunity cost. But first, some clarification. DLO tries to say, look, but there are also companies that work in the car field and they want to innovate a car, right? That falls out of the debate. Why? Companies like that, but also companies like Apple that produce their own products often have indoor testing facilities, right? So Apple has an indoor testing facilities where they test iPhones. So we think good innovation of better cars still happens on our side of the house. Why do bad companies not have that? We think bad companies need the seal of approval from magazines like Oxford or whatever, because if they have an indoor testing facility and Philip Morris says, oh, smoking isn't bad, nobody is going to believe them. So they can't have their own inside researchers because they need that seal of approval. Whilst if Apple says, oh, there's a new iPhone that's better than the previous one, presumably people would believe that and they don't need the seal of approval of an Oxford magazine. I'll take your point.
There is literally no smoking company that publishes and supports any study that says that smoking isn't bad.
Yes, there is. They have a huge incentive to do so, right? So Philip Morris pushes for studies that disprove certain testing methods or say, oh, smoking is only harmful on the long term. We say that history has proven that this happens. But then let's talk about bad governments. I'm first going to start with the main way off here. They say there are certain bad governments that refuse to fund certain things. We say, yeah, but there are bad governments that do the same. Let's weigh them off. Why are bad governments not something you should give them the win on? First, because it's a short-term issue. Like, Trump is in power for 8 years. Compare that to a company where the tobacco industry has been in power for a century, right? You can't take their power away, whilst the government you can hold accountable. But second, Trump might not fund climate change, but he still funds other research, right? Whilst corporations don't have incentive to fund a broad field of researchers, right? So if you believe this is a debate about Trump versus the tobacco industry, you shouldn't care about Trump. That's not big enough of a problem to give them the win on. So let's actually talk about those incentives of companies. They tell you this: companies will fund good research because of PR. But Panel, their LO, also says that research is extremely expensive. So if they want good PR, it's more likely they would give a donation to an NGO that doesn't require you to set up an entire research system. If you believe that the incentive of companies is PR, there are way cheaper, easier ways to do that. So likely the actual incentive is profit, right? Why? Because they need to give up quick money to their shareholders. So they're short-term incentivized and want direct profit. What does that mean? That means that the kind of research that they're going to push is not breast cancer research, is that has nothing to do with it. Like the LO said, that's ridiculous. It's likely going to be research that is in favor of their own product, right? So at the moment you sell a certain food, that might be research that says, oh, that is quite good food, it's healthy for you, so that more people buy it, so it's good for their profit, because it's a logical decision to make. But let's say there are still some good companies. Why are the kind of companies that are going to invest in research likely going to be bad companies opposed to the good companies that they talk about but have never specified in two opposition speeches? One, because bad companies have the biggest necessity for this research. Because without research, Coca-Cola can never claim that it's healthy to drink Coke. Whilst at the moment they fund research that says, oh, obesity isn't caused by sugar but by movement, which they have done in the USA, that means that they have the biggest necessity for that. But that also means that bad companies are willing to spend the most of this kind of research, right? So that means that even though you believe that Romania proves that there are some good companies, we prove that bad companies have a way bigger incentive, thus that there are way more bad companies that actually invented this, and they can't win on good companies alone, because presumably bad companies outweigh them. But let's take them at their very best and say, even if there's some good research, what is good? Literally, they've never clarified to us what good research has come from companies. LO says marketing strategies. How does marketing impact the average citizen? I have no idea at all. That self-centered research that they produce that only benefits their company, but it's not in the incentive of the average citizen. So we think it's then better to invest in things that are actually good for the average citizen. So here's where we come to an opportunity cost. Even if there's some good research, like some marketing studies that do impact the average citizen, we think there's way better research that actually helps people more, like research into medicine, for example, or things how to live cheaper. Those are things that are beneficial for the average citizen. Why is that a direct opportunity cost? We think, one, resources are often limited. So you have limited researchers who are specialized enough in one specific field to conduct a study. They can't do two things at the same time. But at the moment that the government says, please search the cure for cancer, versus a company that says, here you have billions of dollars to research why Coca-Cola doesn't cause cancer, it's likely an institution is going to choose the one that gives them billions of profit. That makes sense. So that means that even if they prove, this is their best case scenario, that there's some good research, it crowds out even better research because resources are limited. Look at our side of the house, we still have Bill Gates that can fund some research, but specifically that's still going to be limited, no thank you. Then they say, no, because institutions will never publish bad studies. They won't do it. That's ridiculous. We see peer pressure is an inherently flawed system for two reasons. One, academics are scared to contradict the big companies, right? They say, researchers are underpaid. Well, that's true, then it's likely that at the moment the big companies willing to pay you billions of dollars to research something, at the moment you're a critical peer thinker, you're scared to do that because peer review often happens within the same academic institution. But second, we've given you the unique, no thank you, out of order, the unique reason why often these magazines want to have flashy headlines that attract a multitude of reader, right? Because if that study, because academic research often isn't necessarily wrong or right. Within the food industry, it's often highly context-based because there are a lot of variables. So it doesn't necessarily backlash on them. But they want to attract as many readers as possible, right? So that means that they are likely going to critically filter everything because there's $1 billion industry behind it that's going to prevent them to do so. in the end, it's going to be bad companies that are going to fund this research due to the structural incentive they have. This looks like the pharmaceutical industry in the US that has made sure that millions of people are addicted to fentanyl, which is 3 times more addictive than heroin. This looks like the tobacco industry that in the 1950s made us believe that smoking isn't addictive. It looks like the oil industry that made us believe that climate change doesn't exist because they have the University of Washington telling them that it actually is going to be a long-term harm instead of happening within the next 20 years. Opposition needs to defend these things because they've already happened. We banned them once and for all and refuse to stand for these examples. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
I thank that speaker very much and welcome the third speaker for the opposition.
Can you hear me? Is everything fine?
Yep.
Okay. Marlboro paid for research that smoking is healthy. We still found out it isn't healthy when that scientific paper was ripped to shreds through peer review. McDonald's doesn't want you to know that sugar is bad for you. We still somehow do. And it's not because we're super smart and we're super informed, but because it's common knowledge. Come on, guys. There were, for every scientific paper that ever said something that was done by a corporation and that was a factual lie, there are 10 other studies disproving that completely. What does this prove? It proves that all of the impacts of team proposition, which are essentially that we're being lied to by these greedy corporations that want to destroy us all, they're false. Because every time a bad outcome happens, we have ways to get rid of that. Most of the time, those aren't even put in academic papers. We explained that on first speaker. We explained that on second speaker. They didn't want to interact with that. We win this debate. So I have 2 clashes. First, regarding getting good research on our side of the house, no, thank you. Secondly, how we get research in the necessary fields. First of all, about getting good research. Their entire nuanced argumentation with 3 points here and 4 points there essentially boils down to one thing, that you receive the outcome from the company. Because look at their actual analysis, right? The fact that you already get the hypothesis, which means that you receive the outcome from the company. The fact that you don't have any critical thinking, which happens because you receive the outcome from the company. And the fact that you have a quick research, you're forced to have quick research, which happens because you receive the outcome from the company. Guys, they're basically the same mechanism. So let me disprove that. All prestigious institutions would say no to a company coming in, giving them money and saying, here, I want a skewed result. Because this is why they're so prestigious. First of all, because they don't need the funds from the company. They already get massive funds. But secondly, because if I'm MIT, I'm not going to destroy my entire reputation for some amount of money in a second. I'm not going to do that because I'm so prestigious. Also, if I do that, I can't be prestigious anymore. So already most of their impacts fall because all prestigious institutions will choose not to have such an outrageous thing ever happen. Before I move on to the other reasons why this argument is wrong, go on.
Institutions are not lying. It's just that scientists are encouraged to read data in a certain way because they know it will lead to more sponsoring in the future.
That's lying. So if they're not lying and the data is correct, that means that we got valuable research. But if they read it in a skewed way, that means they're lying, which again would attempt at their prestigiousness. Now, the second reason why their argumentation is wrong, the fact that peer review cuts out most of the bad outcomes. And here side proposition comes in on the third speaker and explains that, first of all, they're scared to contradict the companies because all peer review is done in the same institution. No, it's not. We explained from the first speaker, it's done all over the globe. We live in a globalized society. So we're telling you that peer review happens everywhere, all the time, in institutions that aren't controlled monetarily by the people supporting the initial research. Moreover, they talked about magazines. We disproved that again from the first speaker. Check your flow. We told you how we don't even get there because in most situations, they're not going to publish those. No, thank you. Third reason why the argumentation is wrong is even if this is the case, we're telling you that it's more likely that a company will just bribe the researcher instead of going through the actual university and the institution, which can also happen on their side of the house. So we believe that even in the worst of situations, they're not comparative. What did we provide in this clash point? First, that most of the time it's not the companies that are approaching institutions, it's the institutions that are approaching companies to get the funding. We said that from the very first speech. They again failed to interact on second and third. This was very important because from the very first speech, we explained that you have incentives to find answers because you are interested as an institution in finding that answer. So you're not going to destroy your entire work just for some money. It would defeat the purpose. Your purpose is to find your answer. Moreover, we told you that the institutions want to keep their reputation, so they're not going to be perverted by company incentive. Moreover, we explained that researchers have their own reputation to keep in mind. They don't want to be fired by the institution or to be that guy that published a scientific paper that was basically made by Coca-Cola. So what does this all prove? That on our side, it's more likely to get accurate research. And even in the worst case scenario, when there is some bad research that appears on their side of the house, we still get to read it out. What is the impact? So we're telling you that we win this point by a landslide because most of the research that is financed by these companies is actually very beneficial research. And they accused us that we didn't give enough examples. So let me add a few to the ones that my colleagues already explained. On first, we actually talked about an example about breast cancer and how this is going to be supported. On second, we explained how lung cancer is actually invested, research for lung cancer is invested into by corporations. Moreover than that, we even talked about the green energy and climate change on our second speaker when we told you that people like Elon Musk, no thank you, are more likely to invest into research that is pro climate change in order to support their green energy company. And we gave you two reasons here. First of all, that sometimes the interest of the population aligns with the interest of the companies. And secondly, we explained how it's a better PR move to have my name on a scientific paper that helps people than to have my name on a library that is just a vanity project. So this is why on our side of the house, we get significantly better, we get good research financed by these companies, and this research is extremely important. Actually, before I move on into the second clash point, sure.
Considering there's a limit on the amount of research published every year, would you rather have governments control that or private companies who only
I'm getting into that. So second clash point about necessary research. Again, they suffer from the same issue. Most of their argumentation with their 4 layers of argumentation are actually rebutted from the very first speech. The fact that innovators are going to companies, they'll do it more on your side of the house. They haven't responded to that. They haven't addressed it on second prop. The fact that you have limited resources. Again, we told you how because these companies are very prestigious, you're going to choose to not waste your time on useless research because on useless research for the institution or for other people, specifically because you as a prestigious institution want to get the answers for the important questions. Thirdly, they talked about how you're going to publish all those terrible things into good papers. We explained how in order for something to be published in a good paper, it needs to be peer reviewed. So again, this mechanism falls because after it's peer reviewed and we found out, hey, this was all financed by a corporation and this is actually wrong, it's not going to be published, it's not going to get most of the time to the press. Fourth thing they said is that you waste time on peer reviews. Come on, guys, the way peer reviews actually work is that somebody looks at the methodology that you had when you created the research and then says, look, there's an issue here, there's an issue there, there's probably not any conclusive evidence. What I just did is I addressed all of the argumentation on how we have unnecessary research. But even if we have some unnecessary research, there is more research overall because there is significantly more funding. Most of the funding comes from the corporate sector. We're telling you that Marlboro invests in cancer research, and this is not a unique example. This generally happens. Is the corporate, is the private that invests into research. And we explained how on their side of the house, you let states choose what we research. And here side proposition comes in and explains, but we can vote them out. They missed the point entirely. We're not saying that corporate-sponsored research is better than state-sponsored research, or one of them should decide. We explained that the moment you have multiple ways in which you can get your money, either through the state or through corporations or both, that means you have more academic power. You can choose what to research and what not to. You have more sources, which means you have more development, which means you generally are more independent. This is why we oppose.
I thank that speaker very much, and I welcome the opposition reply speaker.
Can you hear me if I speak like this?
Yep.
Team Proposition hinges a lot of their case in today's debate on anecdotal examples. They tell us evil oil companies are sponsoring studies that prove climate change isn't real. How many studies prove that climate change isn't real? Sure, there might be one or two that Team Proposition is gonna constantly point at, but the vast majority of scientific evidence tells us climate change is real. Tobacco industry is paying researchers to prove to us that smoking doesn't cause cancer. Who in the researching community believes that? Sure, maybe one paper that Team Proposition may point at does, but the vast majority don't. And so all of their impacts, their overblown ideas about how the evil corporations are infiltrating the research field and they're destroying all of our very reliable data, it's just not true. But what they are destroying on their side of the house is the incentive, the manpower, the funding needed to carry out things like stem cell research, like breast cancer research. This is the real comparative of today's debate. Before anything else, one big clarification. The reason why most examples that Team Proposition gives are from at some point in the 20th century is because since we're not anymore in the 20th century, all of their mechanisms about how, these things aren't peer-reviewed don't work anymore. In an era of digital interconnectedness, it is very easy to check papers, to get peer review from researchers all around the world. These sorts of things are more and more functional every day. They work better and better on our side of the house. Okay. One big point that we gave to you in today's debate was that you get less money, less funding for research. And that's important because every single penny matters. When it comes to urgent issues like climate change, we can't just wait 8 years until the Trump administration is kicked out of the White House and we finally have a sane government that is willing to invest in green energy. No, we need those investments now. So if it all comes down to what the government wants to invest in, we're in big trouble. It's not so easy to brush off as Team Proposition would have you believe. So what sort of research is really funded? Again, we've explained to you time and time again that there is an incentive for corporations to look good on the short term, right? And through investing millions of dollars in things like cancer research, right? And we've given you all of the anecdotal examples that Team Proposition likes on our side of the house about tobacco companies that are funding these sorts of things. Right? They tell us, but Bill Gates is going to do it as well on your side of the house. Sure, but Microsoft, Amazon, Tesla won't do it. That's where the big money is, and that's where the CSR interest really lies. We think that the comparative here that they miss is that the short-term incentives of politicians lead them to resort to tools like populist short-term economic measures, whereas companies, the only real short-term thing that they can do to boost their image is this sort of work for things that actually benefit communities. Oh, and also, when they tell us that they just spend this money on things that matter to them and you get more research about consumer behavior. What's so bad about researching consumer behavior, guys? Behavioral economics is a field that exists, and we think that it should probably continue to exist if its funding comes from corporations, if they're the only ones willing to fund it. Sure, that's still a benefit on our side of the house. And then their idea of skewed results. They talk about how corporations go to prestigious institutions in order for them to be able to have research that is rubber stamped by them. But then if prestigious universities are caught up in a big scandal relating to their reputation, they're no longer prestigious, so companies won't come to them to sponsor their own research. The financial incentive that you talk about works on our side of the house because institutions are incentivized to keep their reputation. Oh, and the comparative, by the way, if you're keeping all the money in the private sector to researchers that work in the private sector, more researchers will go towards the private sector. So if it really is that superficial aims are the ones that corporations care about, that's more studies on that on your side of the house. We win today's debate.
I thank that speaker very much, and I welcome the proposition reply speaker.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
While the tobacco industry knew for 40 years that smoking will kill you, it was held a secret from the public because it was in the interest of the tobacco industry to not research that. What are exactly the incentives of companies? We told you from the start, the incentive of companies are to make profit. How does it then weigh off against the prestige of university and publishing paper? We told you the reason these papers care about prestige is because it allows them to later make more money. Therefore, if we give them money through corporate funding, they're more likely to do so because it's direct influence. We tell you that tobacco has no incentives to take care of cancer because it's easier to prove cancer isn't a result from cigarettes. In the end, companies only care about profit. So if they care about PR, it's easier to just donate to NGOs. If they want to have independent innovation, they can do so on both sides of the house because that's not research that needs to be published. They can make their own iPhones. They can make their own electric cars. This debate is about whether or not an iPhone will cause cancer in your brain and whether or not that is research that needs to be done. Let's take side opposition at their best. Opposition tells you that we have a massive funding problem inside research. If you believe that, that is the reason corporations are immensely powerful in the academic field. If opposition case is true, the difference is that research without corporate funding has all the harms. They told you corporate funding holds all the cards because it's the only way to ever get research. That's the reason they are able to force scientists to create flawed science. That's the reason they're able to force scientists to research in our immense pressure and do it in way too short of time. It's the reason they are able to never allow critics to say their research isn't true because they hold all the cards if you believe side opposition's case. But if you believe that, why do we then still win? We told you from the start there are some outside funds such as NGOs and alumni. So even if it's not comparative at all and there's massively more corporate funding, we probably are able to have some kind of research because of alumni donation, because of NGOs like Bill Gates. If you don't wait at all, we told you how corporate research crowds out the good ones because they use the same amount of equipment, because they use the test groups, because they use the laboratoria. That means corporate investment is useless on its own because it never creates the good scientific outcomes we want because it only cares about their own incentive. We would rather have now less research done in the proper fields because that's the only way you can in the end get the cure of cancer. In the end, if you believe the entirety of opposition's characterization on a massive amount of funding, note that this is the only harm they have. We still take this debate because at least the funding we have will be directed to a good cause. However, we told you the funding problem isn't as bad as opposition claimed. We told you from the start how the problem inside this field is that the smart one go to this corporate funding research. If they can't publish what will happen on our side of the house, they probably won't go public because that's not their job. But secondly, we told you how the problem is that good research is never published because papers have an incentive to publish corporate research first because it's more flashy, because they have a bigger stronghold inside these industries, because it's what their readers care more about. But thirdly, we told you how the public is more likely to believe the research corporate makes because because they can allow the public to know what they know. So yes, in the tobacco industry, it took a couple of decades for us to find out. And in the end, we might have found out. But it caused millions of people to die because of cancer because they were able to keep it a secret for such a long amount of time. Lastly, we told you how the university forces researchers to do these kinds of research because they wanted extra funding. That doesn't mean they need it because they right now use alumni funding and NGO funding to build new libraries, but they want more money and therefore they force the smart ones to work on it. In the end, we tell you we're able to have good research properly funded on our side of the house, but only if you not have the corporate funding exist because they're the ones that crowd out all the rest. So proud to propose.
I thank that speaker very much and all speakers for an excellent debate. I'm going to tell Orgcom to move us judges out of the room and we will hopefully be back to you in about 20-25 minutes with a call. Good luck.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for the debate.
Thank you for the debate.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.